Good evening, and happy Chanukah, Freilich and Chanukah Sameach. We are celebrating not just Chanukah, not just the holiday, we're celebrating our conclusion together of the Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, our conclusion of the second part of the Tanya. Before I get into these handouts and I get into the summary and the conclusion of this part of Tanya, I do want to talk a little bit about what we're going to learn next, God willing, so that in case anyone has to leave early, no one will leave without next week, God willing. What we are going to learn next in this class, God willing, is rather than doing one long thing, which is what we've done now twice in a row. We studied a very long mimer of the Chabad Chassidic. Now we've studied a very long whole part of Tanya. So what we're going to do is we're going to learn, they're not really miscellaneous, but let's say assorted is a better word, assorted Maimarim, short discourses from different Rebbes of Chabad. And the reason they're not miscellaneous is that they're all going to have a theme. We're going to learn a bunch of different Maimarim, and all of them are going to be practical, what are called Aveda Maimarim. There's two different types of Chassidic discourses in Chabad. There's Haskala Maimarim and Aveda Maimarim. There's philosophy, which is what we've been studying in this class for years at this juncture. And then there is practical Chassidus. How do you live your life according to the principles that we've been discussing? Because since we've been learning for so long about abstract ideas, very interesting and very true and very fundamental abstract ideas, but abstract ideas nevertheless, I think it's a good time for us to turn away from studying the more abstract philosophy and to study simple, in some sense it's much more difficult actually, but we're going to study practical, more down-to-earth, how do you live as a Jew? That's going to be our theme. So instead of what do you need to know as a Jew, and what does the faith of a Jew or the knowledge of a Jew entail, which is what we've been studying now for two very long discourses, we're going to be learning a sort of different Maimarim, like from lots of different angles, different authors, different styles. So we'll keep it very fresh and keep it very dynamic and interesting. And we're going to study a series of discourses all about how a Jew serves God practically, in all different ways, from all different aspects. No, not in Jewish law. How you serve God as a chassid, with the inspiration, with the not just the fulfilling of God's will, but the true service, the true worship of God in davening and Torah study and the performance of mitzvahs. Not just technically doing it the correct way, like what you would learn in Shulchan Aruch, but doing it in the way that we connect with God and we worship God wholeheartedly. Although that itself, the question of what is the difference between keeping Shulchan learning and serving God with Chassidus, that itself is a very interesting question that we will be discussing. That will be part of what we do, because we're going to see what Chassidus adds to the practical service of God that you don't know just from studying Jewish law, etc. So that is my general plan, and so it's going to be God willing, a different thing every 1, 2, or 3 weeks. We're going to be learning a different discourse from a different perspective with different information. Sometimes the actual thing that we learn, the actual text, will be very short, and so I'll spend a lot more time explaining and we'll spend just a little time reading. Sometimes it'll be mostly just reading what it says, because a lot of it will be much more straightforward and easier to understand than what we've been studying here in Tanya. And so we'll get a very nice, I think, multiple perspectives, variance, texture. It's not going to be the same thing over and over, and it's going to be things the hope is that you'll be able to leave the class quite often with an idea of something you can practically implement, an idea of something, not just as we've been learning in to give the impression that this is not practically implementable. On the contrary, everything that we've been studying is the very, very necessary what a Jew has to think about. It's the content of a Jew's mind and a Jew's soul, the faith and knowledge of God that we constantly have to be thinking about, and that's no small thing either. That's also a practical directive. But the practical directives in what we're going to be learning are going to be much more varied and much more inescapable, so to speak. It's going to say very clearly what a person is supposed to do. We're not going to have to extrapolate out or place it in any kind of context. So that's my plan. That's what we're going to learn next. We're going to learn a series of discourses all about the worship of God. But before we get to that, we have this evening's celebration. So without further ado, let's do our summary, our brief summary with the remaining 50 minutes. We're going to talk about what is this book that we just finished. The Shaar HaYichud v'Ha'emunah, the second part of Tanya, the Gate of Unity and Faith. Let's start on the side with the...
You're not going to show the cake to the ones,
I don't want to make them any more jealous. That would be terrible.
No, so now they know there's a cake and ice cream. Ice cream is not here, but there is ice cream. Yeah.
We're going to start with the side of the paper that has the diagram on it. The picture of the Alter Rebbe. The picture of the Alter Rebbe is just so that we have the picture of the Alter Rebbe. This diagram is, as it says at the top of the page, the structure of the second part of Tanya. I was kind of describing it abstractly last week without something to show you, so I decided to actually make this little diagram. And I just want to, this is the very brief overview, and then on the other side we have the more detailed overview, the more detailed summary, which we're going to go through. So, the general overview of Shaar HaYichud v'Ha'emunah is like this. This is what you miss if you spend too much time zoomed all the way in, right? You have to step back and see don't miss the forest for the trees, right? You have to see the Shaar HaYichud v'Ha'emunah. Shaar HaYichud v'Ha'emunah of the Alter Rebbe, like everything that the Alter Rebbe wrote, by the way, is an unbelievably structured and terse, short and dense book. It has a lot of information compressed into a very small space, just like the rest of Tanya. And there is in it that is not with a purpose. Everything that is in it contributes to the overall structure. And many of the Rebbe's comments and the Rebbe's talks about Shaar HaYichud v'Ha'emunah are all about how things which seem to have no place are really, if you think about it, expressing the theme of the book, and precisely in the way that it needs to be expressed in that location. In other words, it's answering a question or it's bringing out a point deeper. Everything that's in Shaar HaYichud v'Ha'emunah contributes to the overall structure of the book. What is this book about? This book is about the unity of God. The unity of God in Shaar HaYichud v'Ha'emunah, the way that God is one, which really in Shaar HaYichud v'Ha'emunah, that actually means, ironically, two things. The fact that God is one means two general things. The first thing it means is that they're the things that are on the sides of this pyramid. The first thing that it means is the one on the right, which is that nothing other than God exists. The other thing on the left side is that God and everything other than God is godly. Everything other than God himself is also godly. This is the second point of Shaar HaYichud v'Ha'emunah. And as we're going to talk about a little bit more in a bit, really these 2 points are 1 point. It's not such a, it's not that the unity of God expresses in 2 points, which would be very counterintuitive. It's really 1 point. So if it's really 1 point, why does it become two different things in Shaar HaYichud v'Ha'emunah? Right? Why are there two different ways of expressing this 1 point? That nothing other than God exists is one way of saying it, and God is absolutely simple is the other way of saying it. Right? The reason there are two different ways of saying this 1 point, that God is absolutely unified, is because for a student of this idea, that God is absolutely unified, a student with a body of flesh and blood, the student has to learn in a certain order. In other words, you can't just tell someone God is one and expect them to understand the full richness of the idea without breaking it up into a structure to come to this idea. And the way to come to this idea in its fullness, in its richness, is the way the Alter Rebbe has done it. In other words, the Shaar HaYichud v'Ha'emunah is structured to bring the student to the full understanding of God's unity as expressed in Yiddishkeit, as expressed in Judaism. To that end, there has to be a process. You can't just instantaneously acquire this idea. You have to go through it step by step, because that's how our minds work. You have to go through it in a certain process. That process is what I've described in this diagram, this triangular diagram. So we start on the right. Judaism, we read right to left. Chaim. So I have here only 3 chapters in the book, because really, just to understand the structure, you really only need 3 chapters, which is why these are the 3 chapters I've written. Those are chapters 1, chapter 7, and chapter 12. Chapter 1. Now you see on the left side here, this is the, I've done the, what's it called? It's the x-axis, right? It's been a long time since I've been in school. I've done the x-axis. You have the top, as you go up, it's more godly, and as you go down, it's more worldly. That's how we have this triangular structure, right? And obviously, right to left is as you progress through the book. I didn't even mark that one, so because I felt it was obvious. So we start in chapter 1 over here. At the bottom of the worldly pyramid. For those who are watching online, I'll share a link to this file, God willing, after the stream, so you can see what I'm talking about. It won't help to hold it in front of the camera because the camera reverses it, whatever. So, we start with chapter 1. Chapter 1, we start with the assumption of a created world independent of God. That's the assumption that we come into Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah with. The Alter Rebbe then spends 6 chapters teaching us, as we go up this line here from chapter 1, that nothing other than God exists. That's what the first 6 chapters of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah are about. And we arrive at the peak. In other words, we get more and more abstract. We climb further and further away from the world as it is and God and a godly perspective. And in chapter at the peak of this process. Chapter 7 explains of 2 unities, as I've written here. The higher unity, which is that there is only godliness in different forms in different places. And the lower level unity, which is that the world that appears other is really godly. In other words, the difference between the higher level unity and the lower level unity is really the direction from which you arrive, right? The lower unity says that which appears to be separate from God is really one with Him. The higher level unity doesn't even take into account that things may appear separate from God. It says there's godliness, and that godliness is what everything is in different forms in different places. The lower and the higher level unity correspond to the 2 halves of this part of Tanya. In other words, the lower level unity is the capstone of chapter 1 through chapter 6. Then we begin to talk about the higher level unity, which is really in chapter 7 a new idea. New idea. It's the idea that from God's perspective, in other words, it really is God, and He is absolutely simple. None of these distinctions and levels that we've been discussing are really real from God's perspective. And from chapter 8 through chapter 12, as we talk about this point, God is absolutely simple. We come down and down and down, back towards the world, until in chapter 12, as we concluded last week, we conclude that the infinite God is absolutely simple, even in the place of the created world. Right? In other words, we climb up for the first 6 chapters to say essentially that the world, even in its source, is absolutely nothing other than God. And then from there we say, and that God, who is absolutely one, is present where? He's present even here. We come back down again. We say that God who is absolutely one in Atzilus, in the spheres. And He's absolutely one in the Maimarim, in the words that He speaks. And He's absolutely one the creations that the words produce. That's what chapter 12 is, right? So we take that higher concept and we bring it down into the world. That's the flow of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. So you have a pyramid structure. You started with the world, you end with the world, and in between you climb up to a very, very abstract understanding of godliness. That's the structure of the Tanya. And chapter 7 is like the hinge. Chapter 7 is where the 2 perspectives switch. Okay? That's the general structure of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. Now, let's turn the page over. We'll do a summary by chapter, and then, God willing, at the end, I'll discuss more about this structure and how we can see from everything that we've learned why this whole process is necessary. In other words, we're going to go into more detail about what the Alter Rebbe actually says in Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, and then at the end we're going to talk about why was this process necessary again. We're going to talk about that idea again, that you couldn't just come out and tell you, for example, what it says in chapter 10 right at the beginning. You have to first learn 1 through 6, then. So we're going to look first at what it says, and then we're going to return to the structure and really try and see the Alter Rebbe's intention in why he wrote the whole Sefer this way. And then, God willing, this can serve as a foundation for anyone who wants to go back. And in our future learnings, God willing, many times of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, we can use this understanding to learn it in a much more orderly fashion, right? As I've mentioned in this class many times, my rabbi in yeshiva used to say that the first time you learn it is only so that the second time isn't the first time, right? The first time we learned it, we've learned it now just so that you know where everything is in the book. And now starts the real, after this class, when you go back, you can really learn it, right? Because you see the whole thing as one piece, now you can really learn it. Anyway, so let's do the summary, okay? We're going to go through chapter by chapter, starting on the left here, column by column, okay? This is a very, very brief point-by-point summary. As you can see, I'm not sure you could get any shorter. I tried to make it as short as possible while still containing at least the main points of what it says. Which is chinuch katan, right? You see it in the top left. We said there, in the introduction to Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, what does Alter Rebbe say? He says, I'm writing this book for a reason. What's the reason? Because love and fear of God can be reliably reproduced through a contemplation of faith. In other words, if you learn about faith in God and the true Jewish faith, you can use that in your life to create love and fear of God whenever you need it. You don't just have to rely on inspiration. You can create your own inspiration, which is a very Chabad idea. It's an idea very reflective of Alter Rebbe's general approach. And that is why he is writing Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah. That's the introduction. I'm teaching you all of this about faith and knowledge of God so that you can create your own love and fear of Him. You can form, this is the tool by which you can form your own emotional relationship with God. That's what it said in the introduction. Then we start with chapter 1. Now I want to point out, I've divided the chapters into four larger headings, right? Which you can see are underlined here. This is the most general summary possible. It's a 4-line summary of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, right? We have the first 3 chapters are going to be what I called here the basic argument. The basic argument, starting in the most basic terms that the world is nothing, is chapters 1, 2, and 3. Right? In chapter 1, we start with a statement of faith, as we spoke about at the time. Chapter 1 does not give you any intellectual arguments. It's all just a citation of the Baal Shem Tov and explaining what the Baal Shem Tov says. Right? What does the Baal Shem Tov say? He says, each creation, from the loftiest to the very lowest, in being and soul, meaning the fact that it exists and what it is, exists due to the constant speech of God. God is constantly speaking everything into existence. This is the foundational teaching of the Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah. From this teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, the Alter Rebbe makes 12 chapters. Right? That's chapter 1. Chapter 2, we begin by saying that this is an intellectual repetition of chapter 1 for the inner heretic. Right? What we learned by faith in chapter 1, in chapter 2, we're going to explain to the We're going to explain it in a way that the animal soul, even with its mind, right, even a rational mind, can understand this like it understands anything else, like it understands mathematics, for example, right? What do we discuss in chapter 2? We say, what's the explanation, the rational explanation for the Baal Shem Tov's teaching? The Baal Shem Tov said, the world, everything in the world is just, why does everything in the world exist? Because God is constantly speaking it into existence. We said, how can you understand that? Because the world is created from nothing. And if it is created from nothing, it requires constant involvement to keep it going. That's the core of the Alter Rebbe's argument, right? His famous metaphor is the splitting of the sea. That's the mashal in chapter 2. If you want, most of the chapters of Shaar HaYichud have like an image associated with them. Like you don't have to, if you're a visual thinker, you can think of the summary in pictures, not in words, right? Chapter 1, you have speaking of the heavens, right? Hashem speaks the heavens into existence. That's an image. Chapter 2, the central image of the chapter, other than the craftsman crafting a vessel, right, which is actually the opposite of what Hashem does, so it's not good as the central vision. The central picture is the splitting of the sea, right? The splitting of the sea requires the constant involvement of God to keep the sea split, as we discussed. Therefore, without God, says chapter 2, we have absolutely nothing. God's involvement is absolutely necessary at every moment to keep the world in existence. That's chapter 2. Chapter 3 asks the question, so what is the world now that he is speaking it into existence? And the answer is, the world is nothing. Nothing but the divine speech itself, right? We say, what's the picture of chapter 3? The image of chapter 3 is the ray of the sun in the sun, right? Just as the ray is in the sun, right? And this, therefore, what does that mean? It means really only the sun is there. So too, when Hashem speaks this cup into existence, the cup is like a ray of the sun in the sun. Hashem speaking the word kos, Hashem speaking the word, right? We explained how there really is no result to the process of creation. It's not like Hashem speaks and then something pops into existence as the result, right? Really, all there is Hashem speaking, and the cup is actually just the act of Hashem speaking. And there is no aspect, there is no property that the cup has apart from or independent of the speech of Hashem. The fact that it's white comes from Hashem. The fact that it exists at all comes from the speech of Hashem. There is no aspect of it which is apart from that divine speech. And therefore, what is the cup as we perceive it? Really, the cup as we perceive it is just a perception, right? There is no whiteness. There is no physical object here, because anything all of that is really just the speech of Hashem. So, right? And we spent a lot of time discussing how this doesn't mean that the universe doesn't exist. It means it doesn't exist other than exist. Ein oid milvadai. There is no other apart from you. As long as we see that the cup is not an other, the cup does exist, right? As we discussed in chapter 3. I mentioned here that this is the first version of the ray of the sun in the sun. The second version is all the way over in chapter 10, as we'll see, right? And we explained at length how, not in chapter 3, but in chapter 10, how really the two different metaphors are explaining two totally different ideas. Almost opposite ideas, in fact, which is confusing. So we continue in chapter 3, we conclude that the universe adds nothing to God. Or a different way of saying this, in the Frierdiker Rebbe's beautiful language, which is the Frierdiker Rebbe's phrase, is the most beautiful, imaginable, I think, one-line summary of chapters 2 and 3. Which, by the way, chapters 2 and 3 are so rich on their own. It's a whole lifetime, just chapters 2 and chapter 3, understanding this argument. Right, explaining to your animal soul this truth. The Frierdiker Rebbe's summation is that, or I'm paraphrasing, but chapter 2 says that without God you have nothing.
Frierdiker Rebbe?
Of the previous Rebbe, yeah, the Frierdiker Rebbe, Rebbe Rayatz, the Rebbe's father-in-law. Chapter 2 says that without God you have nothing. Chapter 3 says that even with God you have nothing. Right? I mentioned this in the class. Maybe you weren't here, Al. If the first time you're hearing this, I mentioned this at least 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Chapter 2 says that without God there is nothing, right? Because you need God to constantly be involved to create everything. Chapter 3 says, but even with God, what is there really here? Nothing. Because what has been added to God by God creating? Nothing, right? The act of creation does not actually create something apart from God. Right? All the act of creation is an act of creation, and the act of creation is godly. So even with God, there's also nothing. So chapter 2 is without God there's nothing. Chapter 3 is even with God there's nothing.
Because it's art. I mean, it's like you're moving a train. So you move the train and you're standing outside.
Yeah.
So you don't really know who is moving. You're moving or the train is
Right,
moving.
it's a relativity, right?
Right. But in this case, it depends who is saying. If in God, yes, there's no difference.
Yeah.
But in our eyes, there's a big difference.
Oh, very good. Okay, we're going to get to that. That's a very good point. That's a very good point. And in fact, has asked the famous question at the end of chapter 3. That's the famous question. It says, having said all that, right, having said this beautiful contemplation and this profound, it's an argument, right? It's, in other words, if you follow the Alter Rebbe's argument, it's meant to be an inescapable conclusion. It's like a philosophical style, let's say. It's a philosophy style argument, right? The truth is that, as we mentioned in those classes, this isn't really philosophy. Well, or you could say it's more honest philosophy, because unlike most philosophies, it recognizes that its foundations are irrational, right, or super rational, because you still need to have faith, number one, that God follows any of the rules of logic that we're saying, right? Which of course we only know because he reveals it in the Torah. He's not obligated to follow any such rules. And number two, the very fact that he creates the world from nothing, which is the starting axiom, the first what's it called? In a syllogism, it's the first principle. No, I don't know. Of the syllogism, in other words, it's the first half of the argument is that it's the first given that the world is created from nothing, right? And creating something from nothing, you must have constant involvement. Therefore, God must constantly be involved in creating the world. So that is also something which is a faith thing, right? The Alter Rebbe never explains to you why it's necessary that God creates the world from nothing. And in fact, he doesn't need to, because that's what a Jew believes, in other words. So that itself, already there you see the richness of the interplay in Shaar HaYichud and Tanya between faith and understanding, right? The Alter Rebbe is not speaking to a complete heretic, as we discussed at great length, but rather to a heretic of a certain kind. He doesn't deny that God created the universe from nothing. He denies God's constant involvement in the universe, hashgacha pratis, miracles, individual providence, divine providence, right? That's the sort of thing he denies. Anyway, the question at the end of chapter 3 is Eyal's question. Alter Rebbe finishes the chapter with a question. The question is, if this is the reality of the world, that this cup is inextricable from the God creating it, and really that's all that's here, how can we not see it? Right? If there is anything here to see, in other words, whatever it is I'm looking at, that is godliness, because there is nothing else that can create the impression that something else is here. So if I'm actually looking at something, then it's godliness I'm looking at. But it doesn't appear to be godliness. I don't see God speaking. I see a cup, right? That's the question at the end of chapter 3. And as we mentioned at the end of chapter 3, the Chassidim have a very famous teaching about this, that normally we don't like to study philosophy because we end at the end of the chapter where the question is, and the question is usually something like, so how can Torah be true? Or so how can there be a God? And even though the philosopher is going to go on and answer the question, you could, God forbid, sleep overnight with this question of how could the Torah be true? Or how could God be real, right? But Chassidim said that when the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya, the question he leaves at the end of the chapter is not how can God be real or how can Torah be real. The question is how can the world be real, given all of what we've said? And that's a very good question to have overnight. In other words, that's a good question to walk away with. In other words, you don't even need to stick around so much for the Alter Rebbe's answer. The Alter Rebbe has an answer, but if you live with the question for a while of how can the world even be real, it's not so terrible. Chassidim always said that's why the chapter ends with a question. Okay, so that's chapters 1, 2, and 3. Chapters 1, 2, and 3 are the basic argument for why the world, even as it is now, right, even with God, the world is nothing. The world, all there is here is godliness. Then, even then, we have the answer. Essentially, chapters 4, 5, and 6 are the answer to the question of chapter 3. Roughly speaking, you could quibble with all of these categorizations, but let's call it like that. These 3 chapters, 4, 5, and 6, I've called accounting for our experience. In other words, there's the basic argument, and then there's 3 whole chapters which help us reconcile the experience of our animal soul, which perceives everything as a separate, independent existence, and the truth that we have learned in chapters 1, 2, and 3. How can I reconcile my perceptions and my worldly existence, where the cup appears to exist, with the truth that I've learned in 3? So that's why you have chapters 4, 5, and 6, and it's a very, very deep explanation. It's a very deep answer. Chapter 4, we begin by discussing that God has two different names, Havaya and Elokim. Right? Havaya refers to God's trait or action of kindness and revelation. Elokim refers to his trait or action of severity and self-concealment, right? And so we give the basic answer to the question. Why don't we see God? Because God is hiding himself. That's the answer to the question. It's not a problem with our eyes, right, Ronnie? It's not a problem with our Eine Basar. It's a problem with, it's not our fleshly eyes, but rather it is something that God himself has done. He has concealed himself. And in fact, his ability to conceal himself is as impossible to understand as his ability to reveal himself.
We may see, we just don't know that we see.
That's the point. But why don't, of course, we're seeing godliness when we see the cup. That's all there is here. That's actually in chapter 6. So you're running ahead of me. Chapter 5. Chapter 5 says, divine self-concealment of the same act. This was a short and tricky chapter, highly recommended for review, right? A very tricky concept, which is that the divine self-revelation and the divine self-concealment are not really two different things that God does, but rather they are one thing that God does in the act of creation, because that act consists of Eres and Kalim, light and vessel. The very act by which God is using his light to reveal himself to create the cup, he is using the vessel in that same act to conceal his revelation in that cup, with the result that we see a independent reality from God. Chapter 6, we get to Eyal's point, which is that since revelation and concealment are both one with God, the concealment is no true concealment, right? When we look at the concealment of God, what are we still looking at? We're still looking at godliness, right? Just as his revelation is godly, so too is his concealment godly. It's just as godly, in fact, as his revelation. Right? So when we look at the cup and we actually see this independent reality, we're just seeing a different type of experience. Right? We're seeing a different form of godliness. The difference is that this is a form that we don't experience as godly. Right? And also, always remembering that when we talk about we mean the creation. The cup itself, so to speak, does not experience it as godly. The cup itself experiences this revelation as non-godly, worldly, separate, independent from God.
But that is just an example.
Yeah.
Because, if God is everywhere, even the air is actually God. So the fact that you are looking at the cup...
No, sure. Air is the same. We can look at air and study air as well. Air is also an object.
God is here and God is everywhere.
Absolutely. But the thing is that we are not discussing God, we're actually discussing the different things that are part of everywhere.
No,
still in chapter 6.
Seeing God. So you're saying, we see God in a cup, we see God in a table, but we see God even if you don't
see but that's again, you're getting ahead of me. Because we're talking about, that's very good. We're talking about the godliness we're still talking about the godliness that is within things, right? We're still talking about the godliness that creates the cup. The thing is that in chapters 4, 5, and 6, we make our understanding of this much more profound and much more rich and much more complex, because we understand also that even though all the cup is godliness, that godliness is really a combination, a mixture of divine self-revelation and divine self-concealment.
So we can't see the godliness in the godliness.
We're not talking about the God that is everywhere. We're talking about the godliness that is constantly creating each and everything in our world, right? The air, the cup, the table. That godliness which is creating it is both a self-revelation of Hashem, and at the same time, in the same act, it is a self-concealment of Hashem, which is why we perceive the thing as being separate from Hashem, as not being godly at all, but rather totally separate from godliness. But the truth is, as it says in the Zohar, that Havaya ve'elikim kulachad, as we read in chapter 6, that really the divine self-revelation and the divine self-concealment are really the same thing, right? We gave several metaphors for this from other Maimarim and different things like that. Is the Talmud, and how the Mishnah is just the Talmud in a smaller space, but the entire Talmud is contained within it, right? Similarly, Elokim is the is Havaya. The divine concealment is the same thing as the divine revelation, just in a smaller or more finite form. But from God's perspective, it's all just the same thing, right? It's all. When Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, when Rebbe looks at the Mishnah, he sees the entire Talmud within it. He doesn't actually have to learn the Talmud. He sees the entire breadth of that whole discussion contained within the smaller space. So too, when Hashem looks at the finite creation, he sees his own infinite self-expression. He sees Havaya in the Elokim, right? So that's the real conclusion. The real conclusion is that, essentially, what I know from chapters 1 through 3, that everything is really nothing but godliness, right? And what I perceive, which is that everything is separate from godliness, in fact, both of those understandings derive from the same place. That's really the conclusion, right, at the end of chapter 6. The conclusion at the end of chapter 6 is that when I perceive the cup as just a cup, that's my perception of Shem Elokim. When I understand chapters 1 through 3 of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah and really contemplate it and come to an appreciation that the cup is nothing but the word of Hashem, right? That's me appreciating Havaya. Which one is the cup? The cup is both, right? It has an and a Kli. Everything in the world has Havaya and Elokim. And the truth is that they're both absolutely godly, and they're in fact one thing. They are one divine expression. Again, like I said, these are difficult chapters. 4, 5, and 6, very much recommended for a review. Very, very tricky stuff, but well worth delving into. So at the end of chapter 6, we've essentially answered the question that was asked at the end of chapter 3, right? Chapters 1 through 3, each thing is nothing but the godly power which is constantly creating it. Chapters 4 through 6, this is true even though, etc. Even though God is self-concealing and there's Kalim and God is making it appear as if that's not the reality, that itself is part of that reality. The divine self-concealment is no contradiction to that fact, that everything is godly, and in fact it's actually part of the explanation of how everything is godly. That's what we decide after the end of chapters 4 through 6. Then the question becomes for chapter 7, and again, chapter 7 is the hinge. So you'll see what I've done here is I've actually divided chapter 7 itself into two sections, unlike every other chapter. Chapter 7 is straddling both halves of this work, right? So you have the question, does the nothing matter? That's what chapter 7 begins by discussing. Chapter 7 begins by saying, okay, so I see that everything is nothing other than the divine speech that creates it. However, I have a question. The question is not God busying himself by speaking this cup into existence? And if God is actually coming down to speak this cup into existence at every moment, does that not ultimately mean is the cup not important? Fine, you say the cup is nothing other than godliness, but sof kol sof, at the end, God is constantly creating this cup. In other words, from God, it seems that God is himself interested in this thing existing. That's the question we start chapter 7 with. And we begin to explain that the universe's source, the source of all of these creations is Malchus. Malchus is God's kingship / God's mouth. It's described as both things. Where do these words that we've been talking about for 6 chapters come from? They come from Malchus. Why the divine kingship? Right? So you'll remember we discussed this many times. Chapter 7, I think we have like 10 or 15 classes or something on chapter 7. There's a lot of stuff. We discussed at great length how the king is defined by the nation. Right? The trait of kingship is different than all the other divine traits because to be a king, you need the zulas, you need the other, you need someone to rule over. No one is a king by themselves, right? You need other people to be a king over them. So when God assumes the role of a king, when he is acting as a king, what does that make room for? It makes room for the independent realities of the creation. So therefore, the source of the entire creation, in other words, why has God begun to speak? Because he is acting as a king. He is a king who he is relating to things in terms of the zulas, in terms of the other, in terms of his nation. So that's the source of everything we were discussing in chapter 6. In other words, where, in chapters 1 through 6, where does everything we've been discussing come from? This divine power which is constantly creating the cup. It comes from God's trait of Malchus, his trait of kingship. And we say in chapter 7 that that trait is itself totally one with God. In other words, there is no action that God does. God never actually departs from himself to be a king. God never actually becomes a king over anything, where it appears as if he's speaking things into existence and therefore they have importance, is all based on him being a king. And what is him being a king? Him being a king is just him being him. It's just God exactly as he is. There is no action or time or departure from God's very being, just as he is. His kingship is absolutely one with him. And therefore, what is everything that comes from his kingship? Everything that comes from his kingship is no different than he was before the 6 days of creation. Right? Nothing has changed. As we said in this chapter, we said, what's the pasuk? Ani havaya
Lo shaniti.
lo shanisi. I, God, have not changed. Yeah, it was good. I, God, have not changed. Right? There is no difference between God before he creates anything and God after he creates everything. Why? Because this whole mouth speaking is not a thing that he is doing to achieve a creation. It is absolutely one with him, as he always has been and always will be. Right? That's what we say in chapter. And we say that this fact is true in two ways. And this is the core of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. How do I know it's the core of the whole book? We skip this line. There's one line which is kind of like the